Before I start, actually, can I ask, is there anyone in the room from Equatorial Guinea or representing a company operating in Equatorial Guinea? No? Mozambique? No, neither. Okay. Well, I think they're all coming tomorrow. Well, I think the important thing about this is I'm going to give you a little taste of what's going on in both countries, but this is not exclusive to Mozambique or Equatorial Guinea. Some of the challenges that we're going to discuss here are across all of the countries that you're all working in. And I think the solutions are pretty common across all of the countries that we're all working in, but this just gives us a chance to kind of drill down to something else and see how it compares, in fact, to a lot of the things we've heard already today. So just going to give you a couple words about CDC Development Solutions and our perspective in this space. Talk about Mozambique and what's going on in local content in Mozambique. Same thing with Equatorial Guinea, and then some ideas on how we might do it differently in the future. So first of all, CDC Development Solutions. We probably, besides not talking about Nigeria today, we're probably also an outlier in the type of company that we are. We are a not-for-profit organization, and our expertise is in small and medium enterprise development. We are not local content experts writ large. What we have expertise in is identifying local businesses that have potential to be suppliers to the oil and gas industry and other major industries, and helping to build the capacity of those companies to meet the very stringent requirements of the industry. So my comments today come from that specific background. We've worked all over the world. We've worked in over 80 countries, and we started doing local content, SME local content programs in Sakhalin about 15 years ago. And we have since worked in about a half a dozen countries in this space, most recently starting some new work in Mozambique, Equatorial Guinea, and we're just launching a new piece of work in Gabon as well. So while we are a not-for-profit, we are different than a lot of development not-for-profits. We do work with some of the traditional funders like the World Bank and USAID, but most of our funding, the overwhelming majority of our funding, comes from the private sector. So Mozambique. What do we know about Mozambique? Well, first of all, we're talking about a population of 23.5 million people and a GDP growth rate of 7% for the last couple of years. So we've got a good population base and we've got a good growth rate, but we've got some real challenges there as well. Serious infrastructure challenges with the roads, serious infrastructure challenges with the ports, and the enabling environment for business is very challenging. The process of obtaining permits is extremely slow. The legal system hasn't caught up with modernity, and there's no private land ownership. Also looking at a 54% poverty rate and a 45% illiteracy rate. Now, 92% of kids who are of the age to go to school are actually enrolled in school, but unfortunately enrollment in school and literacy do not necessarily equate to one another in that environment. We have, again, I mentioned challenges in transportation already, but for businesses also limited access to finance, some challenges around business culture in terms of safety, quality, and accountability. Lots of challenges around the qualification of job seekers to meet the requirements of the market today. So challenges, but many recent discoveries in the Rovuma Basin that are going to make the country a major LNG exporter. The geography is ideal for that LNG production to reach Asian and European markets. This is one of the fastest developing energy players in East Africa, and the country is looking to attract about $50 billion in investments by 2020. So recently we were asked to go into Mozambique and say, well, what does the local supplier base or potential supplier base look like? And we had specific sectors we were supposed to look at: architecture, civil engineering, electrical equipment, steel construction materials, truck rental, and heavy equipment. We were able to, across the entire country, identify 62 total businesses in all of those sectors, and some represented multiple sectors there, but 62 businesses that were ready or almost ready to be suppliers to the industry. 36% of those businesses already had successful oil and gas experience. Of those, 37% had either between 85 and 100% foreign ownership. So they were quote unquote local businesses, but with 85% to 100% foreign ownership. But that said, 35% had majority Mozambican nationals working for the companies, and usually those numbers were well over 90% in terms of the number of Mozambican staff. And what I think these figures point to is how very difficult it is to define local content, and it has not been defined in the Mozambican context. If a company is 100% foreign owned but 97% Mozambican nationals, where do you put that in your understanding of how you quantify local content? And those questions are all still on the table in Mozambique. So we went through a couple of processes. One was we ran a number of focus groups, both with SMEs and with business associations that serve SMEs. And what we heard directly from the SMEs is that they're having trouble finding qualified workers, and foremen in particular, that they have no experience with the multinational procurement process. Access to finance, you're going to hear that raise its head several times over the course of this presentation. We heard that PPE is very expensive, and oftentimes we buy it to check off the box and then don't use it. The infrastructure being another issue, and language, Portuguese language throughout the country, very little English language or other language capability across the nation. From the business association, we heard that the SMEs are really missing information on opportunities. So where are the opportunities to contract with the industry, and what are the standards that we're expected to meet if we are going to capture any of the opportunities out there? They have no access to market research, and they don't even really know where to start on developing partnerships. And you'll see access to finance came up on the association side as well. Beyond the focus groups, our pretty extensive survey process, a lot of our findings mirrored what we heard in the focus groups, but also with some additional pieces here in terms of providing appropriate training being a key need, that there were major challenges to compliance, both contract compliance and things like HSSE standards compliance. That registration and licensing and legal issues are really stopping many businesses from being able to grow, expand, and contract with the industry. That there's a lot of need for JV partnerships, a lot of need for networking skills, financial planning, just very basic business skills. And in terms of priorities, you might have thought the training and consulting or business planning would come to the top. The reason that we particularly said networking was the top priority in Mozambique was because there were a number of businesses that were sort of supplier ready there, but that just didn't have access to the information and didn't have access to the people that could help them to start that contracting process. But the business planning and training consulting, quite important also for those who are not yet ready, or who will be coming up the line in the next few years. So what are the local content standards in Mozambique? What is the government doing to address this situation? Well, so far they're thinking about various regulations, but the most we have is that the EPC contractors do have provisions for local goods and services priority if available, and the if available is the big caveat there. There is an approved strategy for training of human resources for the mineral resources sector, but a strategy and an actual implementation, I think, are two very different things, and we haven't seen too much on the implementation side there. There's a clear limit on expatriate labor, so we have the challenge of an untrained local population, and then the limitations on the expatriate labor, and we got to figure out how to balance that off better. And then the one real standard that we found out there was that Sassoil venture has a target of 80% Mozambican employees by 2015, which is a pretty big target for a project that size. But that's all about employees. It has nothing to do with local contracts. To put that into perspective, Sasol on their last venture had I believe it was a 13% local content requirement. They were able to exceed it. They actually came away with 29% local content in the end, but now we're looking at 80. So who's leading local content in Mozambique? Well, it's not the oil and gas industry. The one program that seems to have been quite effective in Mozambique to date is this Mozal program. Mozal is a venture between BHP, Mitsubishi, the Mozambican government, and the IFC. And basically what they have been doing for the last several years is identifying SMEs, linking them up with mentors, helping to build their capacity to contract with Mozal specifically. And over, I believe it's 4 years now, they've trained 100 SMEs and $30 million in local contracts have gone to the SMEs. So this is a pretty major undertaking with real results, but 100 SMEs and $30 million worth of contracts in a country of 23.5 million is just a drop in the bucket. We also looked at, besides Mozal, we looked at what Rio Tinto and Vale had done in terms of local content development. And the answer was they'd done very little, but learned a lot. And one thing they learned in this process is that if they're really committed to local content, they've got to have procurement offices actually at the project site versus in Maputo. That they really need to go out and do site visits and do due diligence on the suppliers, make sure that they do exist where they're supposed to exist, that they are registered, that they are producing the goods or services that they're supposed to be, that they're theoretically producing. They did find that they could be successful procuring furniture, cement, aggregates, and plumbing materials locally, so that was a good find in an area for them to focus on. And it was interesting because Ernest and Wapa brought up spare parts in Nigeria the other day. We found spare parts to be something that both Vale and Rio Tinto said they did not want to procure on the local market based on the experience in both availability and quality of those spare parts today. That they really needed to have their foreign companies that were suppliers register in Mozambique in order to be suppliers. Right now there's not a lot of strong regulation around that, and so that was something they wanted to focus on. But their learnings from the last few years is that they're both actually in the process of planning some pretty extensive local supplier development programs where they actually will provide the direct capacity building assistance to the supply base. So a little bit about Mozambique. Jump to Equatorial Guinea. You're going to hear some of the same story here, some differences. The first thing you're going to hear that's different is it's a much smaller country. We're talking about under 700,000 official population. There are other estimates out there that put the population a little over 1 million. Not clear which exactly is right, but most official statements stick with the 700,000. And you're also seeing GDP growth of over 7% here in EG. Per capita income, 19,600. It's the highest per capita income in Africa, providing that 685,000 population figure is correct. And that's a 21,000, that's not a typo there, that's a 21,000% increase since 1998 in per capita income. An outlier from EG, also 93.8% literacy rate versus the 55% literacy rate that we saw in Mozambique. So you can see a pretty big advantage there. 78% of that GDP is coming from the oil and gas industry. I'm going to just go back to this for a second. So as I mentioned before, my organization, we're development professionals, and we're looking at how to grow SMEs. For us, EG is a development professional's dream. You've got a relatively small population, you've got a huge economic driver, you've got a good literacy base, and the opportunities to make some major changes in lives and livelihoods in Equatorial Guinea, not quite overnight, but quicker than you're going to see change that you can count in a place like Nigeria or Mozambique. The opportunity is really there, and so we're hoping to see a little more energy directed toward focusing on this local content question. AG is a huge LNG producer. So we're looking at 3.4 million tons per annum. The second LNG train is going to raise that to as much as 20. And they've got 8.5, according to Sonagas, 8.5 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves. And EG does have some local content regulation in their law on hydrocarbons, but there's no real numbers tied to it. The language says contractors shall train and integrate national personnel into all levels of their organizations, without a lot of specificity on exactly what that means. That the contractors will contribute to the training of ministry personnel. It is a US dollar contribution determined by the ministry, taking into account what phase a various project is involved in. And these are considered to be petroleum operation costs. But again, there's just not a lot of definition around these requirements. Another piece of the hydrocarbons law, expatriate personnel can only be employed if you've exhausted all possibilities of recruiting Equato-Guinean personnel. But again, what does that mean in terms of exhausting, and what does it mean in terms of adequately trained? The Ministry of Mines and Industry launched the National Technological Institute a couple of years ago. They're training about 50 people each year, so trying to do some things to get people ready to take over some expat positions. But the estimate of most of the folks that we spoke to on the ground in EG was that you need 7 years on the job plus formal training to replace an expat offshore oil worker. So we got a pretty long curve on that piece. A couple of other interesting facts. The oil and gas sector is 78% of GDP, but only employs 4% of the nation's workers. And even more concerning, from 2010 to 2020, 25,000 to 50,000 young Equato-Guineans will enter the workforce. So the industry, there's no way the industry can absorb even a tenth or less of that labor force that's coming on the market at the rate things are going today. What has the government tried to do also besides the pieces in the law on hydrocarbons to address this? They put forward Decree 127, which basically said 35% of EG ownership of a company is what would make it local. Part of the reason for Decree 127 was because there were many sort of shell companies that were coming in, lots of Nigerian companies, lots of Cameroonians that would just come in and sort of register locally and then be just forwarding goods into the country, and that was counting as local content. So to address this, they said 35% EG ownership, but the decree didn't quite go far enough because it doesn't actually ensure substantive involvement of Equato-Guineans in the business. It's just sort of a flat figure. You own it, and whether you touch it in any way, shape, or form is not necessary. And then in terms of the actual compliance with this, companies are required to comply with it if they want to count as local companies and therefore be able to access the local content set-asides. But the process for becoming compliant is extremely rigorous. It takes a lot of resources to be able to go after this. And what we heard across the board from 100% of the companies that we interviewed that had become compliant, they said there was no financial benefit whatsoever for having gone through the rigmarole to become compliant. But regardless of what is or isn't happening on the government side, there are some things that the companies on the ground are doing. EGLNG has been working for several years, partially because it was the first company that had more specific local content requirements in its contract, having come online far later than the other operators. They're doing a lot of training local businesses, particularly on HSSE, huge focus on HSSE for them. And in their newest venture, they're actually co-locating training resources at the Chamber of Commerce so that they're easily available to local businesses. Hess is doing a lot on local content, but focused almost exclusively on training local employees. So lots and lots of local staff development efforts at Hess. Schlumberger has a really interesting program. Across the board, they treat their local staff as global staff, and EG has had some very big ups and downs in terms of the requirements for Schlumberger projects. And what they have done is actually, at sometimes had as many as 36 Equatorial Guinean employees that they've deployed to other projects around the world. So they're really trying to give more exposure to other environments and everything when people are not needed in that particular environment. And Noble Energy, we recently completed a limited gap analysis for them and are starting a supplier development program. Right now that program is focused largely on the contractors for their social projects, with the idea of sort of starting there and then moving on to where the potential is in more direct supply to the industry. So that's sort of a smattering of what's going on in both countries. I see a lot of heads nodding. I think that this is not unfamiliar to any of you in the environments where you're working in. Our proposal is that there is a model that would work for EG, even given how relatively small it is, given high income levels, that would work for Mozambique, even given the large size of the population, low literacy rates. And I'd like to share a little bit with you about our thoughts. First, let's talk about some of the common themes. We're talking about significant gas reserves in both places, huge economic driver. We're talking about new LNG trains under construction in both environments. We're talking about strategic locations for market access in both environments. Both are ideally geographically positioned to serve European and Asian markets. And the U.S. market, in fact, for EG as well. But they lack clear local content definition. They lack clear local content legislation. Their focus to date in both places has been largely on local employment with very little focus on local supplier development. When you look at the numbers of young people that are entering the workforce in both countries, if you focus only on employment in the industry and you don't start building up the supplier base that can supply both the oil and gas industry as well as other major industries, you're going to get into trouble fairly quickly. And in both places, there's a lack of industry-wide collaboration for supplier development. Some of the things we've learned over the years are that if you're going to be successful in developing your SME supply base, you have to have comprehensive support to SMEs. That means you have to have a directory of SMEs that is available to the industry. That means that you preferably have worked out in advance with the major industry players a minimum set of qualifications by which SMEs can be pre-qualified to go after tenders. That means that you provide training and consulting services to specifically bridge the gaps of what these SMEs need to do in order to be able to meet the standards of the industry. You provide direct linkages to oil and gas tenders. That information is available through a centralized site so that local businesses understand what's out there and have the opportunity to chase it. And you should have an access to finance element in the program, and you've heard that repeated several times, and it's not a surprise, I think, in any of the countries you're representing. Coordinated effort, I think this is really key. We heard lots of good things about programs going on in Nigeria. There's some excellent programs. Imagine if those programs were better coordinated, how much bigger the results would be. We heard about some good things going on in EG. Those programs are completely uncoordinated at this point in time. Again, imagine how many more results we could have in terms of local contracts and jobs created if we were able to do some more coordination among the partners. Realistic expectations. Yeah, this doesn't have, someone just said it about Nigeria. This is was it you? You said it's a mountain. This is a process, and I think that understanding from the industry side that you're not going to find 500 suppliers tomorrow in Mozambique to choose from for any one particular job or jobs is extremely important, that it's going to be years before you start to see real competitive numbers. We used to say the idea of SME local content was that you get it sort of better, cheaper, faster. The reality is that's not true. It's often not cheaper, it's usually not better, and it's sometimes not even faster procuring locally. But if you're in for the long haul and you're making an investment, those are just sort of the realities that we have to work to change. Realistic on the part of the suppliers. We have seen this time and time again, that as suppliers come in and register, they sort of expect they're going to get a $5 million contract tomorrow, or a $10 million contract next week, and understanding that that is in fact not the case. The other piece of being realistic and the other piece of coordinated effort is flexibility. And this is a real key on the industry side, is understanding what the challenges are that face local businesses and being willing to be flexible in the size and scope of contracts if you really are committed to contracting with local businesses. Localization strategy, so lots of times these programs are done with lots of outside assistance, like organizations like mine. It's really important that whenever you put a program like this in place, that it is designed to be taken over by local management in as short of a period as possible. And a minimum commitment, and probably get some raised eyebrows here, but there should be a minimum 5-year commitment on the part of the industry to support the effort directly. I mean a financial commitment, I mean a commitment of the right personnel from the industry side to be involved in this. And we can have the argument up and down the block of whether it should be government or industry making this investment. But the reality is, in the places you're all working, government is often moving too slowly. And there's a lot that the industry can do to start to move the agenda forward and affect a real change in the SME local content space. So I want to tell you about a model that we worked on in Angola that I think is seen as best practice in this space to date. I think it can get better, but this was an enterprise development center in Angola called CAI. It was funded by ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Total, and Senegal, the state oil company. And what this center did was, for the oil industry, it created a local supplier directory, worked with the industry to create the minimum criteria I spoke about before for pre-qualification or certification. And then it worked with the SMEs to register them and to provide them with those certifications. Did SME due diligence for the oil industry. We talked about the lessons learned of Vale and Rio Tinto earlier, that they need to go out and actually check and see whether the SMEs, how the SMEs are working, whether they're registered, whether they're producing what they say. That's something that actually CAI did for the industry. Sector analysis, so specifically looking at what are some new areas where we can procure goods or services locally, or special projects like how about setting up a training session on how to use our online procurement system. On the SME side, again, training and technical assistance. And this program had a small access to finance piece. It did not actually have a finance facility. What it did was provide assistance to small businesses in understanding where they could procure financing in Angola and how they should prepare their records to go about doing it and prepare their applications to go about doing that. And then at the bottom, you see a whole lot of sort of collaboration between the SMEs and the oil and gas industry. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this kind of programming is a lot of people think if you provide training, you provide consulting assistance, and even certification, that the rest of it happens organically. And in my experience doing this for 25 years, it doesn't. It does not, providing training, technical assistance, even providing financing does not necessarily mean that these businesses are aware and able to go out and capture the opportunities that are there. So we spent a fair amount of energy on this program, bringing local businesses together with both the major producers as well as the tier one suppliers, the international services companies who also were big procurers of the services. And over the course of this program, which was 5 years, we saw 250 contracts, I believe it was, go to local Angolan businesses, and over $250 million worth of contracts. So I think I'm at 120 contracts, $250 million worth of contracts going to local businesses, and that's without an access to finance piece. And that sort of given the environment that Angola was that day, which was just exiting 30 years of civil war. So some pretty good results, but there's a chance for them to be a lot better. One of the other things that would have made this program better is if there were linkage to other industries. So this was exclusively focused on building businesses to serve the oil and gas industry. I would always argue that an ideal program would also work with those businesses to identify opportunities in other industries. One, because it's the right thing for the businesses and the economy, but two, because it's actually the right thing for the oil and gas industry in the end as you start to build more competitive local businesses. And just to kind of give you a little picture, in Angola, this program, CAI program, was implemented in 2005. It rolled out. At the very beginning of 2011, it was transferred to local management. But that's long enough, that 5-year time period as it is. But the gap analysis actually took place in 2003. And the discussions on the need for a supplier development program, formal discussions, started in 2001. So it was really a 10-year time span from the initial formal discussions to when this program was handed over to Angolan management and ownership. And 10 years is too long. The average lifespan in Angola today is 55 years. So especially where you've got 55 years, 10 years is far too long to be looking at this program. And this goes back to what I said about what industry can do while government is still considering what they might do. So last comment is just goes back to the idea of a very comprehensive program, that it should have training and advisory services, that if it's not specifically offering vocational education, tech ed, business ed, that it has direct connections to high quality programs in those spaces. And I also threw on here industry human resources, because I think that this is something that's overlooked. There's a huge opportunity for your companies to actually help to build your own supplier base by using industry personnel to work directly with those suppliers. On the access to market side, the supplier database, the networking opportunities we discussed, the linkage to other industries that I mentioned. On finance, both advising SMEs on how to access finance, training banks on how to assess creditworthiness of SMEs, and ideally some kind of finance facility. In EG, they are pretty close to coming to agreement on a partial credit guarantee fund, so that would be something that would help in that space. And then using technology, a lot of the SMEs in the countries we're working are not using technology to tender unless they're forced to. They're not using it for other cost effectiveness measures within their businesses, and for other general business processes. So really being able to introduce more technology into the thing. And that's it.